The goal of the fireside chat is to hear directly from participants in current engine awards. For our participants who are online with us, we want you to use the Q&A to ask questions directly to Olga and Hollie. So not questions about the program, but actually questions based on what we're talking about the experience of being part of the engines program. So I'm going to start by first asking, in the context of the question, for each of you guys to introduce yourselves to everyone today. So the first question is, what's your background as yourself, where you are now as part of the engine, and how did you get involved with an NSF Engines proposal, and what first steps did your team take to start building the coalition? So I'm going to have Olga start, and then we can hear from Hollie.
All right. Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you everyone for joining. So hopefully we'll be able to be helpful as you start on this NSF Engines journey. So yes, my name is Olga Petrova. My background, I am a scientist by training, but I'm the director of the Office of Entrepreneurship and Innovation Partnerships at Binghamton University. And our office specifically manages technology transfer, innovation incubation, as well as economic development for Binghamton University, which is a state university of New York organization. And that is, and currently my role is also deputy CEO for the Upstate New York Energy Storage Engine. And the way that I have been involved with this, our office has been the lead on the engines proposal, given that we play these three roles that intersect with the main pillars of the engine. Our office has been leading the efforts. And do you want me, Kimberly, to go in straight into, or do you want to do the intros first?
So why don't you just talk a little bit about how you brought your team together? So Danielle showed a video that talked in particular about upstate New York, and we can elaborate. We have plenty of time, but just some basic steps that you guys took as a university to get started.
Absolutely. So, and that is a very good point, because we were coming from the university, the academic perspective, which of course we work a lot with the NSF, but when it comes to place-based economic development, while we have experience in this, we do not have all of the expertise that is necessary to build a regional innovation engine. We specifically come from a slightly different perspective, because we did start with an Department of Commerce EDA Build Back Better Regional Challenge Award, a BBRC award that was focused more narrowly on a smaller region than what the engines has allowed us to really expand in upstate New York. And it also focused on a very specific part of the battery and energy storage supply chain. But I guess I can take a step back of how did we start building the coalition under Build Back Better. So when we were deciding on the topic area, we did have certain strengths in the region around clean energy, very robust incubator system that was supported by the state. State has made investments in energy storage. So we had both R&D and incubation strengths, as well as we also looked at the industry that we had in the region and the focus areas that they had, because initially we were thinking sustainability, clean energy, much broader, but looking again at what we had, the portfolio of companies that we had at our incubators, what the strength of the university was in surrounding universities. And a lot of our major corporations in the region do focus on energy storage with planned energy storage expansions. That's the topic area that we did select to be more narrowly focused on. And from there, so I can't understate the importance of industry, because if you look at what an engine, a regional innovation engine, is supposed to do, where you are really building a nation-leading ecosystem in a specific industry, you can't do it without the industry. Use-inspired research, R&D, that use-inspired has to come with industry. So engaging those industry partners was absolutely key. And we actually did with Build Back Better what, we are NSF I-Core customer discovery practitioners. We put that into use, where we, for both partnerships and program design, we actually had what we called 50 company discovery calls with over 50 companies, where we were going through what are your technical needs, what are your current R&D needs, what are your workforce needs, and that informed how we designed the programs. So, but in addition, as a university, while we dabble in economic development, again, we're not experts. So bringing in the regional government, regional economic development organizations, such as we have industrial development authorities, as well as industry boards and coalitions, as well as the state economic development entity. So in New York, we have Empire State Development. That was a very important step for us as well. And then expansion around educational organizations, because we do need that representation across multiple levels, which really also touches on broadening participation and filling those workforce gaps. So K through 12 community colleges were very big partners for us as well. And in terms of being a regional innovation engine and having those regional, so leading the nation, but having regional impacts, you can't have regional impacts unless you have trusted pathways to reach the underrepresented, underserved communities, disadvantaged communities. And this is where partnerships with community organizations, community foundations were really key. So we're really building out with approaches of, hey, here are the pillars that we have to fill, but we can't go it alone. So bringing in partners that would inform the program design as well and empower that design.
Awesome. So as seems to happen always, you opened the door right into Hollie's project. So Hollie, tell us about North Dakota. Some of our participants might be surprised to find Fargo on the list and the Fargo region on the list. So can you tell us a little bit about your university piece? You also have this EPSCoR background. And so maybe just give us the big picture and, like Olga did, walk us into the project.
I mean, I would really echo a lot of what Olga had said. You know, one of the things that we always share with people is, as a region, you have to, you know, kind of identify what your major is. And in North Dakota, we know that that's agriculture, and we have a robust set of industry and venture capital and research and development components related to that. And so I think, you know, I don't want to repeat everything that Olga just said, but so yes to all of that, right? Making sure you have the right people, the right place, the right partners. With that, we did have with our Chamber of Commerce, our Fargo Moorhead West Fargo Chamber of Commerce, the Good Jobs Challenge, which is one federal piece that's different from New York, but we also have the I-Corps. So we had already done some work in that area, but I think more specifically, EPSCoR was a major component of really preparing North Dakota to launch into the engine endeavor, where, you know, we've had multiple years of opportunities to connect across the state and figure out what people cared about, what communities cared about. And for North Dakota, it was very much a people play. You know, we recognize that oftentimes we're overlooked as an area of innovation and technology, when in fact we have the second largest Microsoft campus in the country. We have a lot of startups and industries, a lot of entrepreneurs, and people are coming to North Dakota for a number of reasons. Some you might expect: cost of living, right, ease of access, things like that. But also because we have these vibrant, rich communities of untapped talent who are ready to jump in and start to build something better together. So as we came together, we were really thinking about, you know, who needs to be at the table, because, you know, if you're in a state like ours, we have a very low population. And so we have an opportunity to bring in more voices, but then figuring out who's missing becomes a challenge at times. So I was brought in specifically for that. We already had a really sort of thriving way of working together in agriculture through Grand Farm and through state investment and through federal investment. We have a lot of investment through USDA into our use-inspired research. But to Olga's point, the use-inspired piece is the most important, not the research piece. And so we really had to think about, what do growers need? What do communities need? So our goal is to stand up an ag tech ecosystem, but we're really working from the premise that identifying local context-based solutions are going to be the things that can be replicated across the globe. And so with that, we have the unique opportunity, because we have the only established tribal college system in the country, and we have 5 nations within our borders, to really think about what it means to feed the world, to really think about what sustainability means. And so we partnered with the North Dakota Tribal College System and 2 tribal colleges to really think about the ways to merge Western knowledge with Indigenous knowledge. And the goal in that really is to think about the broadening participation, I think, for many of you who are listening, where when I was brought in, the work had already started. They'd been working probably 6 months on building these teams, but the engagement and inclusion piece is central. It's critical. to the success of any of these projects. And my experience with EPSCoR and almost every other federal grant I've ever been involved with has always included diverse populations as more of a checkbox, right? People who are brought in at the tail end, people who are benefiting from but not a part of the design of a project. And so for us, it was very important not only to develop authentic relationships, but to ensure that, if we're going to say that we are committed to equity in action, that that's evident through our governance board, through our stakeholders, through the ways that we align our standard operating procedures, the way that we're designing research. And I can't speak for NSF reviewers, but I think that was one of our strengths was we were really trying to do it differently. And that matters, right? When you're looking at the ways that these engines are designed, they're intended to drive economic development across regions, not for specific populations within regions. And we knew that we were working with a technology, ag technology, that is typically characterized in a very certain sort of way in terms of who's in that space. And we know that there's a far more diverse array of thinking around ag tech and what that means to communities. And so we were really intentional to think about the new American populations that we have across the state and what they're bringing from their home countries as they're establishing themselves in our communities and what that means for ag tech. And thinking very intentionally about all of the people who are left out of conversations as it relates to research and design. So thinking about the ways that formerly incarcerated individuals, who are coming out of the justice system can be incorporated in, thinking about the ways that we can incorporate veterans into our programs, thinking about the ways that we can shift, right, the perception of ag and ag tech and really broaden that so people understand that it's not just about technology and it's not just about growing, right? There are all of these spaces in between. So within our education and workforce development piece, I would echo what Olga had said, right? The inclusion and engagement piece can't be limited to education and workforce development because that then, creates the conditions to where people from diverse communities still end up being the recipients of rather than co-constructors of a project. And so,
Hollie, I'm gonna
I'm
jump
sorry.
in. It's okay. You didn't tell us who you are. So
Well, you
tell
didn't
us
ask
about
me.
yourself.
I thought you thought I was.
No, I want you to start with that, just like with Olga. So who are
Okay.
you?
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
Just tell us about yourself.
I was
And now
answering the
that we know what
question.
you've been doing,
Yeah.
now we can hear about you.
Yeah, we'll reverse it, right? So, Hollie Mackey. I am currently the Chief Strategy Officer for the North Dakota Ag Tech Engine. And my background, I was a professor and primarily a policy analyst looking at federal, state, and tribal policies as they relate to Indian self-determination and nationhood. And so prior to, the reason I was late to the party on our engine is I had just returned back from DC. I was a presidential appointee in the Biden administration. I was the executive director for the White House Initiative on advancing educational equity, excellence, and economic opportunity for Native Americans and strengthening tribal colleges and universities. So my interest in the DEIA piece, is what it was called when we applied, was strong. But they brought me in specifically for that. And I think as you're crafting your proposals, it becomes kind of a sticky way to think about the way you're crafting, because I know that we have an entire team very committed to inclusion, and they weren't entirely sure how to go about with inclusion in the right way. And so I was able to join the team, a few months after they had started the work and had kind of laid out the foundation of kind of what we were going to address, to really think about the ways that we could build more inclusive spaces and really create an engine that was going to benefit everybody within our region of service, rather than have it be that same old sort of way that grants work.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to have Hollie answer this one next too. So what did you consider when you selected the lead organization from within the coalition, or what before you arrived even? How did it end up with the particular lead organization? And then how did you think about the region of service? So there's a couple questions about this too. And just to remind everyone, for the solicitation this time, the region of service has to be contiguous. And I'll just leave it there. There's lots of information about that on our website and in the webinar, but that is one of the rules. But for you guys, that people did something a little bit different. But Hollie, talk about your region of service and how you think about that and
So
the
ours
lead.
is, ours is a contiguous region of service. It's the external boundaries of the state of North Dakota. Although we do have stakeholders and partners that extend beyond those borders, but there's a direct connection back in. And I think the most important piece on the lead organization and the conversations that we had in really thinking through what was necessary is who can support managing the cooperative agreement. It's an incredibly large cooperative agreement with a whole lot of moving parts. And so while we had one of our core partners is a nonprofit who does work with federal and state grants, we selected the university specifically because we already have the Office of Research and Creative Activity. We have sponsored programs. We have this infrastructure in place to ensure that as we embarked on this really ambitious project, that we had the stability there. And that was something that we really thought about. I know we've talked to some of the other engines who have done it a few different ways, but for us, that was the way that made the most sense. And I suspect we'll continue along that path. I think that as the project has evolved, we've really had to think about into the future, like what supports are going to be necessary, like with the reporting compliance and all of those pieces. And so, that's why we selected the university. I will say we've had some challenges with that I would encourage you all to think about early, particularly because governance is such a key piece to what is happening within the engines, where, if you're in a state that has very wide, like open meetings laws and open records laws, right? Nobody's trying to hide any information, but, we have a governance board of 5. So if we have a group text, we would be in violation of the state North Dakota's like open meetings. So, we had to really make a decision. Like NDSU was the entity that could best handle and manage that grant to make sure that we stayed in complete compliance throughout the project as we got started. But also there's some trade-offs that you'll have to think about as you're developing your governance.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Olga, why don't you talk about how you guys, Binghamton was out in front, I think, early, so maybe the lead organization piece was not so much in question, but you did tell us that the BBRC region of engagement was smaller. So can you talk a little bit about how you've decided about the region of service and what challenges, that's good and bad, things that have happened related to that?
Yes, absolutely. So yes, with Build Back Better, we did have a much smaller. It was, I believe, about 10 counties, and we were non-contiguous. So we have an interesting thing that we do have that concentration of R&D infrastructure, R&D expertise, as well as a number of corporations that are, as I said, expanding energy storage manufacturing operations around that southern tier part of New York. And then we had in the north, Rochester and Monroe County, which has also made they've partnered with us in a lot of things. They have additional prototyping and scale up infrastructure in this space. So during Build Back Better, we did have this. EDA did allow non-contiguous. But when the engines opportunity came out, we really wanted to build on that foundation. Hey, we had this strength around very specific part of the supply chain, battery cell manufacturing, some chemistries, battery cell manufacturing. But in order to address all of the major issues around storage demand, energy storage demand, and climate change goals, when New York has some of the highest energy storage goals, by some of the most ambitious by 2030, we really had to look beyond and look at that downstream, the OEMs, the application end of life and recycling. And in order to do that, we really wanted to make sure that we had all of the necessary partners on board. So there we decided that, hey, New York, upstate New York, that western part, has a lot more strength. So Rochester is an official partner. Syracuse, with Syracuse University, they had very specific expertise in solid state batteries. So we decided to bring them on. If we're going further west, Buffalo, additional infrastructure as well as seed funds. So one of our core partners is Launch New York, one of the most active seed funds in the nation. And that has one of the strongest portfolios when it comes to percentage of investments in underrepresented founders. So that was a very important piece for us, because in our region in Upstate, I know some of you might be sitting on the call and being like, does New York really need one? Well, Upstate is not New York City. And when it comes to corporate venture investments, we're really lagging behind, and we can't compete with New York. So for us, having that representation was really important. So it really was building out this network of resources, infrastructure that once connected really does create that engine and hub. Because again, we're sort of separated and siloed, where if a company comes in early stage, well, okay, go to Binghamton to do this early stage things, and then they have to discover that Rochester has that next scale up capability, versus now as an engine, we're sort of really working towards that one-stop shop, New Energy New York, where company comes in and we take you through the entire pathway, connecting you to all of these spokes within the region. And I also wanted to echo on what Hollie was saying in terms of governance and core partners, the importance of thinking about that and the representation, because talking about the diversity of partners that, and from the previous response, that you do need all of these different organizations, types of organizations represented as your partners. But we also made sure that when it came to core partners, we have that representation, that it's not only academic institutions, but that industry is represented. We do have an industry trade association, which New York Battery and Energy Storage Technology Consortium, which really has been pioneering both policy and those connections networking across the state. We do have the seed fund that I mentioned that does a lot of really great diversity work in the innovation space. So we're making sure, and industry, we do have one industry partner on the governance board, really making sure that we have that representation. And then we also, towards ex officio for the board, are making sure that, and we have state partners. So we have Empire State Development, our lead economic development organization, the entire research foundation for the State University of New York. So this way we can be connected across the entire state to all of the educational and research organizations, and also the New York State Research and Development, New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, the lead economic development organization that focuses on energy. So having all of those as core partners that are driving the vision and that are driving and helping us inform that was really important.
So I have a very quick question for Olga, and I just want a quick answer. Then I'm gonna ask Hollie a few things. So someone is asking how you structured the organization. I think you guys you don't have a 501c3 or a 501c6, but can you explain how this is operating inside of the university? And I think Hollie mentioned some of the challenges of this as well.
Yes, and that is something that we're working through. So we're structuring the governance board and the CEO. Yes, the CEO exists within the university, but the idea is that the vision, mission, the implementation of the engine really should be driven by those core partners that are represented on the governance board, that this does not become a single lead organization or a single lead university initiative, because we want to make sure that the programs that are designed and implemented are benefiting the region and all of the stakeholders, and that the funding is also shared across the stakeholders. And also, again,
oh, we're hearing somebody on the line. Can somebody mute that for us? Thanks. So, oh, still not fixed. Oh, okay, great, thanks. So I'm gonna shift us to Hollie and take some of what Olga said and give a North Dakota spin on it. So tell us a little bit about the state level relationships and the tribal nations relationships that you had coming into the work on the engine, what kind of funding they've committed. And you don't necessarily need to give us dollar amounts, but I think people are interested in how you show the buy-in from these partners. And so can you give us, for North Dakota, a little bit of a map? Like Olga just gave us all these amazing things that New York State has. And so even though upstate New York is not New York City, the state of New York is kind of robust in its support systems. And as a Midwesterner myself, I'm not sure North Dakota is there on all this kind of support. So can you talk a little bit about that piece of it for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a much different context. And I think that those are different things. I know when she talked about like the CUNY system, right, having a central foundation, we don't have a centralized system like that with a centralized foundation. And so what we have done is really, we had the state investment into Grand Farm, one of our core partners, who they're a 501c3 with a 600-acre test farm where we're looking to test innovation, right, in real time. And so there was that investment on the state's part into Grand Farm, right? And then one of the things that we really thought about was like, what does it look like to invest in? So of course we have a lot of the USDA ARS funding. There's a lot of the work that we had the foundation for. And then we're working with one of our other core partners is the Greater Fargo-Moorhead Economic Development Corporation, who has connections all over this state. We have venture capital, we have 50 South Capital and Generator who have supported us. But I think the biggest piece of support that we had, and these are not financial contributions. We didn't have people who were saying, you get X million and we'll give you X million. We're in the process now of establishing those relationships. Again, we're a people play, and venture capital isn't just going to throw money at you because you have an idea, right? You have to prove yourself first. And I think that that's something really to think about, particularly with venture capital and industry. But what we had was a collective effort on the parts of our governor and our senators and our House rep to really advocate for us. And then on the local level, we had local legislators also willing to advocate for us. And from the tribal communities side, we partnered with tribal colleges first before we started to think about what it looks like to partner specifically with a tribal nation. Tribal nations have far more diverse range of needs, right, and things that they're thinking about. And so we started with the tribal colleges with the goal of then really taking the first 2 years as we developed our infrastructure to take the time to understand in what ways the engine can be of benefit and be leveraged, right, both for and with tribal nations. And so to that end, I think the investments just look different. We have, John Deere and we have Bobcat and we have a lot of different industry partners who are, they're in the engine and they're invested in us, but they're not invested monetarily yet, right? So they're looking at in-kind contributions of, for example, what would it look like if you had, major industry sponsor use-inspired researchers to play in the engine in the NDSU research space? We have a couple of venture capital funds since the award, which doesn't help you now, who have committed seed funding, right, in ways that they want to help move this. But I think it also goes, I know we're going to talk about challenges, but that is one of the challenges is, you're asking people to commit in ways that are largely unknown. And I think now that the first round of engines has gone, it's not as unknown. So we had, universities committing some seed funding, perhaps for emerging research, and we had, different types of investments in that way. But really, it was the commitment of the community. And, we had hundreds of people show up for our site visit just to support and advocate for the ways that this was so important. We really took the time to develop the relationships necessary to ensure that once we were awarded, then we could very, very quickly ramp up the ways that we could think about those contributions. And so probably for another webinar when we start to talk about the ways that we were successful when we've all been successful. But I would say particularly some states and many of the states on this call are going to have the same sorts of responses that we had. And I would encourage you, one thing I would say, Generator is a venture capital fund that is located in most of the states represented in this call. And they're very interested in partnering with engines in the same way that they have with us. And they've expressed this multiple times. And so I think just working your networks, right? We always talk about using the networks. So while we don't have necessarily monetary investment, we used our networks to develop the relationships necessary to quickly move from relationship to commitments.
That's great. And I think from the NSF side, we want everyone thinking about both, right? You start by building the relationships, and then you can start thinking about how those become contributions and then investments. So thanks. That was really a great answer. Olga, there's a specific question for you about what partnership in the community means. So can you just give an example of an activity that you've done or a particular partnership that you have that might illuminate for people how your engine is working on the community side of things?
So for example, and this is work that we've started under Build Back Better, but the partner has been instrumental. So, and this is something that we got connected to very early on, organization called Southern Door Community Land Trust. So within our organization, it's within our region, it's an organization that is advancing housing justice, but at the same time, really focused on housing. But at the same time, they've been known to do both youth corps and community ambassadors, with the purpose of really educating younger underserved younger members of underserved communities, as well as a lot of these disadvantaged communities, about emerging opportunities in workforce and new job opportunities, workforce development, training opportunities. So we partnered with them, and they've been running a lot of this youth corps that now are focused specifically on energy storage, clean energy, career paths towards that, as well as the community ambassadors that are, again, being trained and then going out to as these trusted community ambassadors and raising awareness. Sorry, there's a siren, I don't know. Raising awareness about the training opportunities, the wraparound services, and everything that we've been providing, both under Build Back Better and these new training opportunities that will be coming under the engines. Something that we've done, it wasn't part of our proposal, but we were actually actively going after this particular partnership, is partnering with our community foundation. Because another thing is, a university working with community organizations, a lot of them are very small, and they don't necessarily, if you're working with your office of sponsored funds or something of the financial office, they might not, some of these community organizations might not have the financial infrastructure and might not pass the rigor of being a sub-awardee. So for us right now, this is lessons learned for us, because we've had slowdowns with working with some of these smaller organizations. So partnering with an organization that has that track record, and we have this network of community foundations that are granting organizations that both do technical support and granting to community organizations as both a support partner and a pass-through entities, because they are an established organization, and that kind of expedites the process. Despite this sort of pass through, it expedites the process and makes it much easier, and also establishes this trusted link with the disadvantaged communities that, let's be honest, not all universities have those trusted relationships within these communities. And that's something that we have been, that was a struggle, and we're still working, because yes, as the large university, you don't always have that coming into the disadvantaged communities.
Great, thanks. So I'm gonna take that specificity from Olga and that question and give it to Hollie in a similar frame, but specific to you. So you have your demonstration farm, right? This is an important piece of your engine. Can you talk a little bit about the incubator model or an accelerator model for things, innovations that might be coming out of ag tech related to your demonstration farm, how the engine is set up to actually help a startup or a small business to actually take that along the TRL levels and out to commercialization or open source licensing? And then also on this communities piece, how that model is complicated in North Dakota with some of the different players that you have: tribal colleges, tribal nations, local governments, state level investment in the farm. Can you just give us a kind of picture of how you guys are navigating all of those pieces?
So I think to the first question, we have the demonstration farm, but we also have all of the research extension centers across the state that we're leaning into, in terms of, like, one of the contributions from North Dakota State University. So it's really, statewide. It's not just the test farm that we have here. But what we've done is, in preparation for our in-person site visit, which I think is helpful for people to know, right? Like, you continue to evolve your ideas. And NSF encourages you to continue to think deeply and evolve your ideas from initial proposal to the end. But we really started to figure out, what would it look like to map out an innovation corridor that goes from ideation to market with use-inspired research in between, right? And so we had developed a pretty comprehensive model for this prior to our site visit and prior to the NSF kickoff. And so what we've been doing for the last few weeks is really thinking about the entry points and exit points. So if you have somebody who just has an idea, where do they enter into and how do we connect them with the NDSU incubator and Grand Farm in terms of thinking about entrepreneurship and idea development and support? We also have areas where people who have more matured ideas can start to get connected through intentional collisions with potential investors. And then we're really looking at the ways that we can compress time to market. Right. And so, how can we take what we know to be true about an existing idea or opportunity and then accelerate that by connecting people to the right resources and the right opportunities to help them do that? And so, through that, then we actually have our use inspired research as a, if you imagine it like four concentric circles, it's really situated more in that third. Right. So we want to be able to continually think about use inspired research and cycle through those quick wins and those quick fails to figure out what's going to work, so then we can really reverse engineer back into the ideation component of our map and think about how we can get those ideas up. And so through that, of course, this is where all of our partners come in, where we have a lot of industry and entrepreneur based partners who are fully vested. We also do this through very intentional collisions through events. So, for example, June 13th, we have an event called Cultivate coming up where we're bringing entrepreneurs and investors and folks with really great ideas that take use inspired research into account, right, for a full week, but one full day where we're really thinking about how do you get to the point where you can pitch, right? So somebody who's never had experience pitching, how do you get them ready? Somebody who doesn't know who to pitch to, how do you connect them to the right people? And so we're really working it on both sides. So we have a short-term and a long-term use-inspired research goal, but we're really focused on that innovation. Where are these good ideas and how can we get people the support they need? And what was the second question was?
I was just wondering if there's a tribal nations
Yeah.
component to that
Mhm.
is a
Mhm.
benefit and also adds maybe some layers.
Right. Yeah. So we have also we funded specifically into our proposal standing up an annual intertribal ag tech summit to bring tribes from across the region together to really think about ag techs, where we can also create those same intentional collisions with industry and investors in a very organized, specific sort of way that it's all tribal ideas that benefit tribal nations. And so the complication, I think, is what people don't take into account is the law, simply the laws on reservations. They're federal laws, they're not state laws, right? How you use land, whether it's in trust or it's not in trust, whether it's privately owned, if it's, there's just so many things to that I think when people partner with tribes, they don't really understand the way that leasing works and the ways that Interior really has a lot of authority and oversight. Where you think, well, it's the tribe's land, why can't they just do what they want? And so we had to think about that, and I think we also had to really consider how we can bridge and develop stronger cross-cultural understanding. When we're talking about equity and diversity and inclusion, right, there's some really like kind of touchy buzzwords for some community areas. And, whether right or wrong, there are things that we have to address. And typically when you're dealing with historically underrepresented populations, right, you run into some challenges between cultural misunderstanding. And so we have built into our engine really a model that takes indigenous and Western knowledge coupled with new American and perhaps, I always call them like the experts in the field who might not have degrees, but they've been doing it their whole lives. How do we take all of these different forms of knowledges to build a stronger North Dakota than we could have alone? And the premise for this, while the engine is important, the funding is important, we're really thinking multiple generations into the future. And how are our children going to interact with one another when they're the legislative representatives? How are all of these communities going to have to really come together, right, in these challenging political and financial times to really build something bigger than ourselves that will last and can be sustained? And so while the engine in ag tech is very, very important, we also saw it as an opportunity to strengthen our communities as a whole and provide opportunities to bring people together who might not have ever been in conversations to see where they have those similar interests and where they're actually very interested in building. And it's been remarkable to watch the ways that as we're bringing people together into the conversations that they've been able to really develop these strategies on how they can move forward.
That's Wonderful. Thank you so much for all, wrapping it in such a big frame for us, I think is really, really helpful. So we just have a few minutes left. The time goes really fast. I'm going to give Olga the chance to pick up on this question that I prepped you guys for, which is an example of a problem that emerged in writing your proposal and how the team was able to overcome it. And Hollie, you'll go next on this one too. So just give us a story.
Well, I think I want to highlight two things that I think is very important when you're putting this together. And this goes back to what Hollie was talking about in terms of broadening participation, inclusive innovation, making sure that the workforce development component, how do we incorporate that with all the community partners, with the K through 12 was never an issue, versus how do we make sure that we are actually developing meaningful, impactful strategies that are not just check marks for the use-inspired R&D and the translation pillars, especially considering that when it comes to energy storage and the specific disciplines that are associated with those are not the most diverse disciplines. And if you are looking in clean energy in terms of the numbers of founders, the percentages of women and minority founders, the amount of VC funding that it's very difficult. So we wanted to make sure that we are developing strategies that actually have impacts and are meaningful. And this is where getting those additional partners, such as Launch New York, where you have 30% of their portfolio is investments into underrepresented founders. It's not that, hey, we're at the university and now going to find a way and propose something that we've never done and figure out. It is bringing those partners to the table and making sure. And this is where we're actually, while we have core partners for use-inspired R&D, we have so many of these smaller schools across the state that are serving rural regions as well. More downstate, closer to the city, we have a lot of more minority serving institutions. So this is where we're like, we have to engage these. While they're not core partners, while they might be a little bit outside of the region, we have to make sure we're engaging institutions that have experience with this and can tell us. Another thing that I think I want to point out, because the evolving vision is the thinking about your partnership and your governance structure from the very beginning, because when you start out, the path is so long towards award. And I think everybody goes in it being optimistic, but not necessarily believing, hey, one day we're going to have to actually start running this, getting this off the ground. And when you approach it as, hey, something that might happen in the future, the idea of setting up those partnership structures, communications, and governance, how do you actually do it? It's such a distant idea that you might not necessarily think, but how do we do conflict resolution? How do we have the proper representation? How do we make sure that the engine is a partner-driven independent entity, not at virtual site visit and then refine it? Hey, the evolving vision, absolutely, you have to do that as you go through, because you have new factors, internal and external, that are coming in. Your industries are changing, but really think forward, because when we started off during the writing period, we did have those core partners defined, but because it did seem like it was such a long way off, I have to be completely honest, the engagement, while we discussed which programs, how it's going to be, the engagement from the core partners wasn't the strongest at that point. And having those discussions of, hey, how are we actually going to run this? What's the governance going to look like? And we even had in the very beginning, like, what does use-inspired research and development actually mean? In the very beginning, we had one of our partners bring their sub-award budget, and it was basically funding graduate students in a specific lab and the reagents for a specific lab. And we had to work through this. This is not about funding your fundamental research. This is really a grander vision, and had to kind of go through those revisions. So making sure that vision, collective vision and governance is developed early on, so that it's not like, oh no, we have to do virtual site visit. All right, let's figure out what it is. But I do have to say that once we did move on to that next stage, it became more real, and we actually were able to get more of those partners, core partners, on board for regular meetings, but where we started working through this which, you know, when the ball is rolling, it's more difficult. But of course, as we say, that you do have to adapt and respond. But I strongly, strongly encourage you, as you're working on putting together your coalition's core partners, and think about your governance, think about how you're going to do this, how the decision making is going to occur from the very beginning. Yes, it can evolve. Yes, it can modify, but take this seriously from the very beginning.
Great. All right, Hollie, you're going to have the last word here today. So tell us a story about something that happened that maybe was hard and how you guys got past that.
Yeah, so I'm gonna look at it kind of in retrospect, like things we didn't know were hard that we're now dealing with. Because I would say yes, everything Olga said, right? You know, one of the challenges is you're bringing all of these people together. Not all of them understand how NSF works. Not all of them understand how budgets work. Not all of them understand a whole lot of things. And so, you know, we had just one challenge I know was, you know, the writing fell on kind of a smaller group. So everyone kind of contributed their pieces, but then we saw an equitable distribution of who was really doing the writing. And so, you know, having those conversations with the people who are contributing, that they need to be involved, because that then goes into kind of like the lessons learned. I think, you know, we had meetings and meetings and meetings and meetings and meetings, and I don't necessarily know that everybody fully understood how all of the pieces worked, right? Um, and probably some of us still don't, right? We're still working through it, right? It was a whole unknown. But I think making sure people know, because it's very difficult to bring people in, right? Or they think they have an understanding, and then perhaps that, you know, isn't what they understand at the end. So I think for me, I would have to say that if I could go back into the process, like I would have pushed for far more transparency on what was in the proposal, but also transparency in budgeting. You know, your budget reflects your values, and so, you know, really, I think when you're dealing with core partners, particularly smaller entities, they don't necessarily understand how all of the budgeting pieces work. And for me, I think that, you know, if you're going to say that you are an equitable institution, right, or an equitable engine, then your budget should reflect that. And so, you know, we've been able to, you know, we brought on some tribal partners after the original budget was developed. And so we've been able to pivot and really think about like carving off pieces to make sure the subawards were manageable, but then not making decisions for those entities, I think is the other piece that, you know, you know, at first there were some ideas about here's what we should do, right, as we bring people on. And instead we paused and said, what do you need?
Yep.
And so, what we would have done in terms of trying to strive towards a more equitable budget distribution was actually more than the tribal partners said that they wanted at the time. They needed to really take the first few years and build it up, and so those are just the two pieces for me. And then, you know, the equity piece, the diversity, right? I think it's like inclusion and engagement or whatever it's called in the
Yep.
new one. Um, you know, the people have been very complimentary towards us on what we've done. We still didn't do it right. You know, the diversity and equity component, you know, wasn't a part of the original conversations. People knew that it needed to be there, but the people who were actually included within those groups weren't included in the framing of most of the proposal. And so we had to do a pretty strong pivot from the time we submitted till the time we had the virtual site visit to the time we had the site visit to really make sure that we were doing it well. And I would say, are we still doing it right? Probably not, but we have really thought intentionally about how we will continue to course correct to make sure that it is a transparent, authentic approach to ecosystem build. Because if you don't have that, then the problems on the back end after award are much more difficult to deal with than if you dealt with them at the beginning.
Thank you guys so much. I think everyone has heard amazing things from you guys, just really helpful and insightful. So we really want to thank you for your time.